Imagine spending years building a multi-billion-dollar company, only to realize that if you applied for a job there today, you wouldn't even get hired. That's exactly what happened when a powerful CEO went undercover to test his own hiring system, only to uncover a shocking web of corruption, backdoor deals, and outright fraud. What he discovered would shake the entire company to its core. But the real question is, how deep does this conspiracy go? Richard Cole had always believed in structure. As the CEO of Westbridge Capital, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm headquartered in New York, he prided himself on running a company that valued integrity, intelligence, and performance. Westbridge wasn't just another firm on Wall Street, it was an institution built on decades of hard work, discipline, and an unshakable commitment to results. But lately, something felt off. The company had been receiving an increasing number of complaints about the hiring process. At first, it was easy to dismiss them as the usual grievances from unsuccessful applicants. Yet, the sheer volume of the concerns troubled him. Some of the best candidates, those with impeccable credentials, were being turned away without a clear explanation. Meanwhile, lesser qualified individuals, many with personal connections to company executives, seemed to be advancing with ease. The rumors about hiring favoritism weren't just whispers in the corridors anymore. They had reached his desk. Richard had built his career on facts, not speculation. He refused to make accusations without solid proof. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The executive boardroom at Westbridge Capital was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, and the polished mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lighting. Richard sat at the head of the table, fingers interlaced, as Jennifer Carter, the company's HR director, placed a file in front of him. Jennifer had been with Westbridge for nearly a decade, known for her sharp instincts and unwavering professionalism. She was the type of person who followed protocol. So when she had insisted on a private meeting, Richard knew it had to be serious. She took a breath before speaking. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this to you, but after what I found, I couldn't ignore it." Richard opened the file. Inside were names, resumes, and timestamps of applications, each one marked with a status: denied, approved, under review. He skimmed the documents, his sharp eyes catching the pattern almost immediately. Highly qualified candidates, those with Ivy League degrees and extensive experience, had been rejected within minutes of applying. Meanwhile, others with barely enough credentials had been pushed through with surprising efficiency. A handful of names reappeared in bold, each one linked to a known executive or high-profile investor. Jennifer leaned forward. "I checked the logs. These approvals were processed manually, bypassing our standard screening system. That doesn't happen by accident." "No, it doesn't." Richard set the file down, his expression unreadable. "Does Sullivan know you've looked into this?" Jennifer hesitated. "He told me not to waste my time. Said the hiring process is working as intended." Mark Sullivan, Westbridge's head of recruitment, had always been smooth, too smooth. He was well-liked, well-connected, and rarely questioned. But Richard had built a career spotting cracks beneath polished surfaces. Something about Sullivan's response didn't sit right with him. "And the records?" Richard asked. Jennifer's hesitation was brief but telling. "They're gone." Richard exhaled slowly. "They were there yesterday," she continued. "But this morning, the logs had been erased. It's like they never existed." That confirmed it. Someone inside the company didn't just want to manipulate the hiring process, they wanted to cover their tracks. Most CEOs, when faced with a problem like this, would call an emergency meeting, conduct an internal audit, and put the legal team to work. But Richard had spent decades navigating corporate warfare. He knew that once you shined a light on corruption, the guilty parties would retreat, regroup, and rewrite the rules before you could catch them. He needed to see the problem from the inside. "I want to apply for a job," he said. Jennifer blinked. "You mean, as yourself?" "No, as someone else." A pause. Then realization crossed her face. "You want to go undercover? Think about it. If I call for an audit, Sullivan and anyone working with him will bury whatever's left of the evidence. But if I apply as an average candidate, I can experience the system firsthand." Jennifer still looked uncertain. "What if they recognize you?" "They won't. I'll use a different name. A different resume. I'll keep it quiet." He met her gaze. "You're the only one who will know." She hesitated, but Richard could see the calculation in her eyes. Jennifer was careful, meticulous, but she was also a realist. After a moment, she nodded. "I'll handle the application." That night, Richard created a new identity, Michael Carter. A solid but unremarkable background, MBA from a mid-tier school. A decade of experience in investment analysis. A respectable but not exceptional work history. Nothing that would raise suspicion, yet still impressive enough to warrant a fair interview. He submitted the application for a mid-level financial analyst position, a role he could do in his sleep. If the system was fair, he should at least get a callback. He would wait, watch, and see how deep this corruption ran. 2 days later, the rejection email arrived. It was short, generic. "Thank you for your interest in Westbridge Capital. After careful review, we have decided to move forward with other candidates." No reason, no feedback, just a quiet dismissal. Richard wasn't surprised. What did surprise him, however, was when he checked the internal hiring system later that evening. The position he had applied for had been filled by a candidate with half his experience and a last name that matched one of Westbridge's senior executives. Richard sat at his desk, the rejection email still open on his screen. The message was cold, impersonal, no explanation, no constructive feedback, just a simple dismissal. It was standard corporate phrasing, the kind designed to avoid liability. But he wasn't just another applicant. He knew what a real rejection should look like. And this wasn't it. He took a slow breath, drumming his fingers against the polished surface of his desk. If this was a mistake, it should be easy to clarify. If it wasn't, then he had just stepped into something far more calculated. Picking up his phone, he dialed the HR department, keeping his voice measured as he spoke. "I recently applied for a financial analyst position. I wanted to check on the status of my application." There was a slight pause before the woman on the other end responded. "I'm sorry, but we've already selected a candidate for that role." "I see. Could you tell me why my application was rejected?" Another pause. A little longer this time. "We had a number of highly qualified candidates. We moved forward with someone who was the best fit for the position." Richard leaned back in his chair, choosing his next words carefully. "I understand that, but I'd like to know what specifically made me unqualified. Was it my experience? My skill set? I'm afraid I can't provide details on individual applications." He kept his tone polite. "I appreciate that, but as someone who took the time to apply, I would think I'm entitled to some form of feedback." "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "I can't help you." And just like that, the line went dead. Jennifer didn't look surprised when he told her what happened. If anything, she looked resigned. "I tried pulling up your application in the system," she said, tapping on her keyboard as she spoke. "But it's not there." Richard frowned. "Not there as in, it doesn't exist." Jennifer turned the screen toward him. The internal hiring database was open, showing the records of all applicants for the financial analyst position. He scanned the list, noting the names and timestamps. His wasn't there. "I checked twice," Jennifer continued. "Your application was in the system when you submitted it. Now it's gone. Someone erased it." She nodded. "And it wasn't an accident. The system logs show a manual deletion. But whoever did it covered their tracks. I can't see who made the change." Richard exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the implications. Someone had made sure he never got past the first stage. Someone with access. His rejection wasn't about his qualifications. It was about keeping him out. Richard didn't waste time. If someone was controlling the hiring process, he needed to know who was benefiting from it. Using his executive access, he pulled up the names of the candidates who had been approved for interviews. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. The first name belonged to Ethan Whitmore, a recent graduate with a mediocre resume but a powerful last name. His father, Lawrence Whitmore, sat on the board of Westbridge Capital. The second name, Ryan Dempsey, had a weak financial background but strong social connections. His uncle? None other than Mark Sullivan, head of recruitment. And then there was the third name, Sasha Liu. No clear connections, no background in finance. She was an anomaly. Jennifer leaned over his shoulder, her voice low. "I don't know who she is, but she's raising red flags." Richard studied the name. Committing it to memory. Any way to find out more? I can check past records. But, she hesitated. Richard, I have to be careful. If someone's already deleting applications, they might be watching the system. Then let's not give them a reason to look at you. He said, I'll find another way. The next morning, Richard took a different approach. Wearing a simple button-down and slacks, he blended in with the junior staff, keeping his head down as he made his way to the recruitment floor. The hiring team was conducting interviews today. If he couldn't get a look at the system, he'd observe the process himself. Slipping into the back of a conference room, he watched as Mark Sullivan led the next candidate inside. Ryan Dempsey. Sullivan was relaxed, smiling, treating the young man like an old friend. Which, of course, he was. The interview was a formality. The questions were vague, the expectations low. Ryan responded with just enough confidence to sound competent but none of the depth needed for a serious finance position. And yet, Sullivan nodded along, throwing out casual remarks about how well-connected Ryan was and how he knew the right people. Richard clenched his jaw. This wasn't just favoritism, it was systemic. The next candidate was different. She was sharp, prepared, and well-spoken, but the moment she answered the first technical question with confidence, Sullivan's body language changed. His smile faded. His questions became curt. He cut her off mid-sentence, shifting in his seat as if he was already dismissing her in his mind. By the time she left, Richard knew she wouldn't be getting a callback. Later that afternoon, Richard returned to his office, his mind racing with everything he had seen. Favoritism wasn't a new concept in corporate hiring, but this was more than the occasional push for a friend's nephew. This was deliberate manipulation, selective erasure, hand-picked candidates. It was controlled, and it was protected. As he considered his next move, his email inbox pinged. A single new message. No sender, no subject. He clicked it open. Stop now while you still can. You have no idea who you're up against. Richard stared at the screen, his pulse steady. He had their attention. Good. Richard sat in his office, staring at the email on his screen. The words were brief, but their meaning was clear. Stop now while you still can. You have no idea who you're up against. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Fear wasn't an unfamiliar feeling, but it was one he had learned to control. The message only confirmed what he already suspected. Mark Sullivan wasn't working alone. This wasn't the kind of corruption that happened in isolation. It was deliberate, structured, and protected. He needed more than a gut feeling. He needed proof. Jennifer agreed to help, though he could see the hesitation in her eyes. She had already risked a lot by retrieving the initial data, and now he was asking for more. But she didn't argue. Instead, she got to work, quietly pulling up records of past hires, searching for patterns. At the same time, Richard reached out to rejected candidates, people whose resumes had mysteriously disappeared. Just like his, he didn't have to look far. Daniel Wright responded first. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet street in Midtown, the kind of place where businessmen met for deals that weren't meant to be overheard. Daniel was already seated when Richard arrived, stirring a cup of coffee with slow, deliberate motions. He looked younger than Richard had expected, early 30s at most, dressed neatly but without the sharpness of someone who had landed the kind of high-level finance job he had trained for. Richard introduced himself under his alias, Michael Carter. I appreciate you meeting me, Richard said as he sat down. I know this is a little unusual. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. You said you applied too? Yeah, didn't even make it to the first round. Daniel gave a short laugh, shaking his head. I wish I could say I was surprised. Richard let the silence stretch for a beat before asking, Can I ask what happened with your application? Daniel hesitated, fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic cup. I got to the interview stage. Thought it went well. Then Sullivan brought up something strange. Richard leaned in slightly. What do you mean? He asked me if I understood how hiring worked at high-level firms. That it wasn't just about credentials, it was about showing commitment. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then he mentioned an opportunity to contribute. Nothing explicit, but the implication was obvious. A contribution, Richard repeated. Daniel nodded. A financial one. An investment in my own future. As he put it, he even suggested a consulting firm that could facilitate things. Richard felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just nepotism, it was a business. When I said no, his entire demeanor changed. Daniel continued, suddenly, I wasn't a good fit. He wrapped up the interview in less than 5 minutes. Got the rejection email that night. Richard absorbed the information. If Sullivan was running a pay-to-play scheme, then the hiring process wasn't just biased, it was outright fraudulent. And if he was taking money in exchange for positions, he wasn't doing it alone. 2 days later, the second warning came. It was early morning when Richard found the email. Unlike the first, this one didn't try to be vague. If you keep pushing, you'll lose more than just a job. The meaning was clear. Someone knew what he was doing, and they wanted him to stop. A few hours later, Jennifer walked into his office. Her face tense. Some of the records I pulled? She said quietly. They're gone. Richard frowned. Gone as in wiped. She said, someone went into the system and erased them completely. No log of the deletion. No trace they were ever there. His grip on the edge of the desk tightened. Whoever was behind this wasn't just covering their tracks. They were doing it with precision. We need to stop for now, Jennifer said. If I keep digging, they're going to know it's me. Richard nodded. He wouldn't put her in that position. But if their enemy was closing off the digital trail, that only meant one thing. He needed a different kind of lead. That night, a message arrived. No name, no subject, just one line. I have proof. Meet me at Orion Cafe, 10 p.m. Richard considered the risk. It could be a trap, or it could be the break he needed. Either way, he was going. The cafe was dimly lit, the hum of conversation blending with the soft clink of glasses and silverware. Richard scanned the room, eyes landing on a woman seated near the back. Emma Collins. He recognized her immediately. She had been with Westbridge for years. A senior recruiter in our. She looked tense, stirring a drink she hadn't touched. You came, she said as he sat down. You reached out. Emma hesitated, then exhaled, rubbing her temples. I don't know why I'm doing this. Richard didn't push. He let the silence settle until she spoke again. I was part of it, she admitted, not from the beginning, but I looked the other way. I processed approvals without asking questions. I told myself it wasn't my problem. She looked up at him, eyes sharp. But it is a problem, and I can't ignore it anymore. Richard waited, letting her find the words. I have emails, she finally said, records of payments, people who got jobs because they paid, people who didn't because they wouldn't. His pulse quickened. You have proof? Emma nodded. I saved copies before Sullivan started purging files. I can give them to you. But you need to be careful. If they find out I talked, I lose everything. Richard met her gaze, steady and certain. Then we make sure they don't find out. Emma swallowed, then reached into her bag, sliding a flash drive across the table. This is everything I have, she said. Use it. Richard took the drive, slipping it into his pocket. He could feel the weight of it, heavier than it should have been. He wasn't just chasing suspicions anymore. He had evidence. Richard sat in his office, the USB drive resting in his palm. It was small, unassuming, just another piece of plastic and metal. But inside, it held something that could upend everything. He plugged it into his laptop and watched as the screen filled with folders labeled with dates, names, and cryptic subject lines. Emma had been thorough. Each email was a thread in a tangled web of corruption. And as he clicked through them, the full picture began to emerge. Mark Sullivan hadn't just been playing favorites. He had turned Westbridge's hiring process into a business, negotiating job placements like backroom deals. One email exchange detailed a direct agreement, a candidate confirming they had transferred funds to an anonymous account, followed by Mark replying that their interview had been scheduled. Another message showed a rejected applicant asking for feedback, only to be met with silence, except for the ones who knew to offer contributions. Then Richard found something even worse. An email thread between Mark and a familiar name, Lawrence Whitmore, a senior member of the board. Whitmore wasn't just aware of what was happening. He was in on it. Mark had been updating him on preferred candidates, justifying selections based on their long-term strategic value. Whitmore's responses were brief, but they said enough. He didn't just approve, he directed. Richard exhaled slowly. Sullivan was corrupt, but Whitmore? He was powerful. This wasn't just a hiring scandal anymore. It was a systemic rot that went all the way to the top. A plan formed in Richard's mind. He needed more than emails, he needed something physical. Something that couldn't be dismissed as fabricated or taken out of context. That meant Mark's office. He waited until the building was quiet. Long past regular hours. Jennifer had managed to keep security from asking questions. And Emma had supplied him with the schedule of the night staff. He only had a small window of time before someone noticed he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. The door to Mark's office was locked. But Emma had given him the keycard. It clicked open smoothly, and Richard slipped inside, closing it behind him. The room smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old leather. The desk was immaculate, each item meticulously arranged, as if Mark was the kind of man who controlled everything down to the last detail. Richard moved quickly. He searched the drawers, flipping through neatly stacked folders. But nothing incriminating surfaced. Then he saw it. An old leather-bound notebook tucked away in the bottom drawer. Hidden beneath a stack of performance reviews. He flipped through the pages and felt his stomach tighten. Names, dates, payment amounts. It was a ledger, a record of every bribe, every manipulated hire. Some names had dollar amounts next to them, while others had a simple checkmark, indicating that the deal had been completed. But one detail stood out: several payments weren't from individuals at all. They were from corporate accounts. Mark hadn't just been placing people with connections. He had been selling positions to outside firms, allowing them to embed employees within Westbridge. Richard wasn't even sure what the endgame was. Influence? Insider trading? Something worse? But one thing was certain. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. The next morning, the atmosphere in the office had changed. A tension hung in the air, subtle but noticeable. Conversations were quieter, glances more cautious. Then came the announcement. Mark had called an emergency HR meeting. Richard didn't attend. He had no reason to. At least not on paper. But Jennifer did. She found him afterward, her expression grim. "He's tightening the walls," she said. "He's saying there's been a security breach in the hiring system. He's threatening to fire anyone caught leaking internal data. He suspects someone." She nodded. "I think he's looking for Emma." Richard's stomach tightened. That night, he called Emma. The line rang, and then, nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. A cold weight settled in his chest. He grabbed his coat and left his apartment, heading straight for her place. The moment he arrived, he knew something was wrong. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks, but it wasn't right. Inside, the lights were off. A cup of tea sat half-finished on the counter. Her laptop was gone. Not just closed or turned off, gone. On the table, a single note. "I can't do this. Be careful. They're watching you." Richard stared at the words, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Emma hadn't just left, she had disappeared. And whoever had made her disappear wanted him to know they could do the same to him. Richard had always believed that the truth, once exposed, would be enough to bring corruption to its knees. But the moment he saw Emma's empty apartment, he knew that wasn't how this was going to play out. The people behind this weren't just covering their tracks, they were erasing them completely. He spent the next several hours making calls, reaching out to anyone who might have heard from her. Former coworkers, friends, even casual acquaintances. Every answer was the same. No one knew where she was. Some hadn't seen her in days. Others sounded nervous, like they were afraid to say too much. Jennifer worked from the inside, checking the company's records. The results were worse than either of them expected. Emma's employee file had been erased. Not just marked inactive, completely gone. No work history, no payroll records, no sign she had ever been employed at Westbridge. That alone was enough to make Richard's blood run cold. Someone with serious authority had made her disappear. Then came the message. A private number. No name. Just a single text. She was forced to resign. They gave her two choices: leave quietly or be investigated for leaking corporate information. Richard clenched his jaw. They weren't just silencing her. They were making sure she could never work in finance again. He had underestimated how far they were willing to go. The attack on him came fast. That evening, news broke. A headline splashed across multiple financial news sites, accusing Westbridge Capital of unethical hiring practices. But the most damaging part wasn't about Mark Sullivan. It was about him. According to the article, CEO Richard Cole had allegedly orchestrated a cover-up, ignoring reports of internal misconduct to protect his own reputation. Anonymous sources claimed he had known about hiring discrepancies for months and had taken no action. The article cited insider accounts, but provided no hard evidence. Still, it didn't matter. The damage was done. The public didn't need proof, just a scandal to believe in. And then, Mark Sullivan made his move. In a carefully crafted statement, he publicly denounced the allegations against him, insisting that Westbridge's hiring process was fair and transparent. Then, in a stroke of calculated brilliance, he shifted the blame. If mistakes were made, he told reporters, then they happened under the leadership of Richard Cole. I've always trusted our leadership team to enforce the highest standards of integrity. It was subtle, but effective. He didn't deny that something might have happened, he just made it clear that if it did, it wasn't his fault. Richard barely had time to react before the board called an emergency meeting. The room was heavy with tension. The board members sat in their usual places, but there was an edge to the atmosphere. A cautious stiffness in the way some of them avoided eye contact. Lawrence Whitmore was there, seated at the far end, silent but watchful. Mark played his role perfectly. He was calm, composed, every word measured. I want to be clear, he said, that I take these allegations seriously. But I also believe we need to focus on protecting the company's reputation. Right now, we need stability. One of the senior board members leaned forward. And you're saying that Richard is the source of the instability? Mark hesitated, just long enough to make it seem like he was reluctant to say it. I think the leadership of this company should reflect accountability. Richard met his gaze across the table. He could see the satisfaction in Mark's eyes. The quiet triumph of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Another board member spoke up. There's no direct evidence that Richard was involved in a cover-up. Mark spread his hands. Then let's allow an investigation to determine that. It was a masterstroke. He wasn't accusing Richard outright. He was merely suggesting that the responsible thing to do would be to conduct a full review. It sounded reasonable, logical, but Richard knew exactly what it meant. A review would drag on for weeks, months even, and during that time, he would be removed from his position, sidelined while Mark and his allies solidified their control. Someone cleared their throat. One of the board's oldest members, a man Richard had known for years, turned toward him. I think the best course of action, he said carefully, is a temporary suspension. 30 days. It's the most neutral path forward. Neutral. Richard almost laughed. It was anything but neutral. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it didn't have to be. The result was clear. Richard Cole was suspended as CEO of Westbridge Capital, effective immediately. As the meeting adjourned, Mark extended a hand to him, feigning sympathy. This is just temporary, he said. I'm sure we'll get everything sorted out soon. Richard didn't take the bait. He stepped past him without a word. This wasn't over. Richard knew he had no time to waste. Being suspended was just the first step in Mark's plan. If he didn't act fast, his absence from Westbridge would turn permanent. The only way to turn things around was to find someone willing to testify against Mark, a person with first-hand knowledge of the hiring corruption. Jennifer, who was now working under the radar, suggested reaching out to Daniel Wright again. He had already experienced Mark's pay-to-play system firsthand. If they could convince him to come forward, it could be a game-changer. Richard met Daniel at a quiet diner, a far cry from their first meeting in the sleek Midtown cafe. The younger man looked anxious, his fingers tapping against the ceramic coffee mug in front of him. He listened carefully as Richard explained the situation, how Mark had manipulated the hiring system, how Emma had disappeared, and how Richard himself was now on the outside. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I want to help, but you don't get it. These people don't just fire you. They ruin you. If I go on record, I'll never work in finance again. Richard leaned forward. If we don't stop this now, they're only going to get bolder. The next person they silence might not just lose their career, they could lose everything. Daniel hesitated, Then, after a long moment, he gave a slow nod. "I'll do it, but I want protection. I'm not going to be the only name on that report." Richard assured him he wasn't alone. They needed more than one voice. And Jennifer had already begun looking for another insider, someone from HR who had seen the altered hiring records. Through an old contact, she found an anonymous employee who had worked under Mark for years. This person had quietly followed orders, modifying records and pushing through select candidates, but had grown uneasy when applications started disappearing without a trace. If Richard and Jennifer could gain their trust, they'd have another key witness. The deeper Richard dug, the worse the situation became. Late one night, while reviewing financial records, he stumbled upon something troubling. A series of large transactions had been made from a corporate account at Westbridge to a private account linked to Mark Sullivan. At first, it looked like an unusual bonus payout, but the dates didn't match any company-wide compensation plans. The numbers didn't add up. He checked again. The account transferring the funds wasn't just a generic company fund. It was tied to a third-party investment firm based offshore. Jennifer helped him trace the origins. The firm had no public website, no clear client list, and most importantly, it was partially owned by a group with direct financial ties to several major Westbridge investors. This wasn't just about Mark pocketing bribes from hopeful job applicants. This was about powerful figures using Westbridge's hiring process to install their own people inside the company. The final proof came in the form of an email. A leaked internal message from HR revealed Mark had personally signed off on hiring recommendations from the investment firm, ensuring that certain individuals, ones hand-picked by the group, were given priority. If this information got out, it wouldn't just be Mark in trouble. It would take down multiple board members as well. Mark, however, was already moving to shut down any threats. Daniel was the first to feel it. A few days after agreeing to help, he called Richard, his voice shaking. "I just got a call from a lawyer. Some firm I've never heard of. They said they highly advise that I reconsider making any statements regarding Westbridge's hiring process." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Did they threaten you?" Daniel hesitated. "Not directly, but they mentioned my employment history. The companies I've applied to. They said if I get involved in a legal dispute, it could complicate future opportunities." Richard understood the message loud and clear. Mark had powerful friends, and they were already working to silence potential whistleblowers. Jennifer was next. She was pulled into a sudden internal investigation, accused of leaking company records. The HR team claimed someone from her department had accessed confidential data without authorization. There was no direct proof tying her to anything yet, but the implication was clear. Mark was covering his tracks, and anyone close to Richard was now a target. That night, just when Richard began to feel the weight of the situation pressing down, his phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a familiar voice came through the line. "I'm safe," Emma said quietly, "but they're watching me. I had to disappear for a while." Relief flooded through him. "Where are you?" "I can't say," she replied, "but I have something you need. I couldn't leave empty-handed." Richard's pulse quickened. "What do you have?" There was a pause. Then she whispered, "A recording." Emma explained that before she fled, she had managed to record a conversation between Mark and one of the board members. In the recording, Mark openly discussed how certain positions were secured through deals with external firms. He mentioned specific sums of money, candidates who had been placed, and the guarantee that these hires would be loyal to the people who put them there, not the company itself. "This isn't just about rigging the hiring process," Emma continued. "They're planting people inside Westbridge, controlling it from within." Richard felt a familiar sense of determination settle in his chest. Mark had done everything he could to push him out. He had framed him, manipulated the board, and threatened anyone who stood in his way. But for the first time since this started, Richard had something Mark couldn't spin or erase. Solid, undeniable evidence. And he wasn't going to waste it. Richard met Emma in a small apartment on the Upper West Side, a place she had been using as a safe house since she disappeared. She looked exhausted but determined, gripping a flash drive in her hand like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Without a word, she handed it to him. He plugged it into his laptop, His heartbeat steady but his mind racing. The file was only 5 minutes long. But from the first few seconds, he knew it was enough to change everything. Mark Sullivan's voice came through, low and confident, as if he had no reason to worry about being recorded. He was speaking to someone else. A man whose voice Richard immediately recognized, Lawrence Whitmore. They weren't just discussing recruitment. They were talking about business transactions. Mark listed off names, candidates who had paid to secure their positions. He spoke of the money being funneled through secondary firms, then laundered through offshore accounts before finally landing in safe hands. They had built an entire system to ensure plausible deniability. Then came the real bombshell. Whitmore's voice was crisp, calculated. The board doesn't need to know how we operate, Mark. They need results. If we get the right people in place, they'll make the right decisions when the time comes. That's how you control an empire. Richard stopped the recording. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't just about Mark. Mark had been sloppy. Whitmore had been strategic. Richard sat back, exhaling. Whitmore hadn't just enabled the hiring fraud, he was the architect of it. He had used Mark as a front, shielding himself from scrutiny while placing key individuals in positions of influence. And now, if Richard didn't act fast, Whitmore would make sure this entire thing was buried. Emma watched him, her expression wary. If you expose this, you realize what happens next, right? Richard met her gaze. I get my company back. Emma shook her head. No, you make enemies out of people who have the power to destroy you. He knew she was right. But the alternative was worse, letting corruption win. Allowing Whitmore to manipulate Westbridge from the shadows while pretending to be a respected board member. That wasn't something Richard could live with. They didn't have time to wait. Emma had been careful, but her survival hadn't gone unnoticed. She had heard whispers. Mark was looking for her. And he wasn't planning to leave anything to chance this time. If they didn't act now, there was a very real chance that someone would get to them before they could release the evidence. Richard made the decision. He would go public with the recording. But it had to be at the right moment, in a way that would make it impossible for Whitmore or Mark to suppress. The plan was forming in his mind when his phone rang. Jennifer's voice was tense on the other end. Richard, you need to get back here. Mark just made his move. By the time Richard arrived at Westbridge, a conference room had already been filled with senior board members. Mark was at the front, speaking in his usual composed, measured tone. The company has been through enough instability in recent months, he said, and I believe we need to take decisive action to ensure Westbridge's integrity remains intact. Richard stepped inside just as Mark continued, which is why I am formally proposing the permanent removal of Richard Cole as CEO. A murmur rippled through the room. Mark folded his hands, adopting a look of professional concern. There have been serious breaches of confidentiality, he continued, and based on recent findings, I believe it is in the company's best interest to move forward under new leadership. Richard kept his face neutral, even as his mind worked at full speed. This was Whitmore's doing. Mark was playing his role. But this was about more than retaliation. Whitmore wanted Richard out before the truth came to light. One of the board members leaned forward. We'll need to vote on this. Whitmore, sitting in his usual spot, finally spoke. I agree. We should proceed with a formal vote. His voice was smooth, unshaken. He already knew how this was going to go. Richard took a slow breath. If they voted him out before he released the evidence, he would have no leverage. They could discredit him as a disgruntled former executive, making sure no one took him seriously. He was running out of time. Richard sat in a dimly lit apartment with Jennifer, Emma, and Daniel, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Time was running out. The board's vote would happen in less than 24 hours. And if he didn't act now, he would be permanently removed from Westbridge. That wasn't just a career-ending move, it was exactly what Whitmore wanted. If Richard lost his title before exposing the truth, he'd be just another disgruntled ex-CEO with a vendetta. No one would take him seriously. They went over the plan again. The recording of Mark's conversation with Whitmore was the key. But it wasn't enough to simply hand it over to the board. Whitmore controlled too many people. And if the information reached them first, it would get buried before it ever saw the light of day. Jennifer leaned forward. We need to take this to the public. If we make this too big to ignore, They won't have a choice. Richard nodded. We need a journalist who won't be intimidated. Emma glanced at him. I know someone. Ethan Miles was the kind of reporter who thrived on high-stakes investigations. He had exposed corporate fraud before, and he wasn't afraid to go up against powerful figures. But he also knew how the system worked. If they didn't bring him enough proof, the story would be crushed before it ever hit the news. They met in a quiet bar away from Midtown, the type of place where deals were made in whispers. Ethan was in his early 50s, with sharp eyes and a demeanor that suggested he had seen too many lies to trust anyone completely. Richard slid a folder across the table. This isn't just about Mark Sullivan. It's bigger. Ethan flipped through the documents, emails, bank transfers, the breakdown of candidates who had bought their way into Westbridge. Then Richard handed him the flash drive. Ethan plugged in his laptop and played the recording. For 5 minutes, the room was silent except for the voices of Mark and Whitmore discussing their corrupt deals. When it ended, Ethan sat back, exhaling slowly. This is enough to start a fire. Richard met his gaze. Can you get it out before noon tomorrow? Ethan hesitated. I can publish, but Westbridge has influence. If someone at the top tries to block it, they could delay the article, kill it before it spreads. Jennifer spoke up. What if we release it ourselves at the same time? Social media, independent news sites, make it go viral before they can stop it. Ethan smirked. Now you're thinking like an investigative journalist. Richard gave him the green light. Ethan would prepare the article, and the moment it went live, Jennifer and Emma would push the story to as many sources as possible. The goal was to create overwhelming public pressure, forcing the board to act before Whitmore could manipulate them. The next morning, Richard walked into Westbridge's headquarters. His presence alone turned heads. He wasn't supposed to be there. The boardroom was packed when he entered. Whitmore sat at the far end of the table, calm and composed as ever. Mark was already standing, addressing the room with his usual self-assured tone. We all understand the importance of stability, Mark was saying. Richard has been a distraction for too long, and this company needs to move forward. That's why I'm formally recommending that we remove him from his position permanently. Richard took a seat, folding his hands. He could see some of the board members nodding, already convinced, but they had no idea what was coming. Whitmore leaned forward slightly, adjusting his tie. I believe a formal vote is in order. Just as the discussion was about to proceed, the first notification buzzed on someone's phone. Then another, and another. One of the board members frowned, glancing at his screen. Then another gasped. A low murmur spread across the room as people reached for their devices. Ethan had published the article. The headline was brutal. Westbridge scandal. CEO hiring scheme exposed, bribery, corruption, and boardroom deals. The story detailed everything, the fraudulent hires, the hidden bank transfers, and most damning of all, the direct involvement of Lawrence Whitmore. Mark's face paled as more people opened their emails, seeing the leaked documents and the audio recording making its rounds online. Phones started ringing. A few board members whispered frantically among themselves, their expressions shifting from confidence to concern. Richard sat back, watching the chaos unfold. Whitmore didn't react right away. He simply steepled his fingers, his mind already calculating his next move. But even he knew the damage was done. One of the senior board members finally spoke up, her voice firm. We need to address this immediately. Another board member turned to Mark. Is this true? Mark's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he was speechless. The head of legal, looking increasingly distressed, cleared his throat. Until we can verify the validity of these claims, I strongly recommend we suspend all individuals implicated in the report. All eyes turned back to Mark. The boardroom fell silent. Then, in a quiet but decisive voice, Whitmore spoke. Effective immediately, Mark Sullivan is placed on indefinite leave pending further investigation. Mark's head snapped toward Whitmore, his expression one of pure shock. He had expected Richard to be removed today, not himself. Whitmore had just thrown him under the bus. Security was called. Mark didn't argue. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket as if still trying to preserve some shred of dignity. But the look in his eyes was different now. The arrogance was gone. In its place, pure fury. As he was escorted out of the room, Richard knew what he was thinking. Mark would do whatever it took to drag Whitmore down with him. Richard had won the battle, but Whitmore still held power. And the war wasn't over. The boardroom was in chaos. The article had shaken Westbridge Capital to its core, sending shockwaves through the financial world. The scandal wasn't just about hiring fraud anymore, it was about the integrity of the company itself. With Mark Sullivan suspended, the immediate threat was neutralized. But Richard knew better than to celebrate. Mark had always been a tool, a necessary distraction to shield the true mastermind from scrutiny. Lawrence Whitmore sat at the head of the table, composed as ever, his expression carefully neutral. He had already positioned himself as the voice of reason, telling the board that the hiring scandal, while unfortunate, was limited to Sullivan's actions. He dismissed the idea that it reflected systemic corruption within the company. "This is an isolated incident," Whitmore said smoothly, "and while it's deeply concerning, it does not define Westbridge Capital. We must be careful not to let a single individual's poor decisions tarnish the reputation we've built over decades." Some board members nodded, eager to contain the damage before it spread further. Others weren't so convinced. The exposure of Sullivan's corruption had made them wary. If Mark had been operating unchecked for so long, what else had they failed to notice? Richard studied the room. The tide was shifting, but not quickly enough. Whitmore still had control over key decision-makers. And as long as he remained in power, the company was at risk. Richard needed more than suspicion, he needed proof. The aftermath of the scandal had put Richard in a difficult position. While some investors supported his return, others viewed him as a liability. The market was reacting to the crisis, and Westbridge's stock had taken a hit. Uncertainty was bad for business, and the board was under pressure to stabilize the situation. Richard knew he was running out of time. If he didn't take down Whitmore soon, the man would reassert his influence and bury any remaining evidence. Jennifer sat across from him in a small office they had been using as a temporary base. "The board is holding another emergency meeting," she said. "They're going to decide whether to reinstate you or force you out permanently." Richard sighed. "Which way do you think they're leaning?" "It's split. Some of them are furious about what happened. But Whitmore's still got allies. If we don't push back now, he'll convince them to move on and restore order." Emma chimed in. "He's buying time. If we don't act, he'll have enough distance from Sullivan's downfall to survive this." Richard tapped his fingers against the desk. He had been expecting Whitmore to retaliate, and the counterattack came faster than he thought. The lawsuit was announced that afternoon. Whitmore's legal team issued a formal statement accusing Richard of defamation and reckless conduct, claiming his actions had caused severe reputational damage to Westbridge Capital. The suit painted Richard as a desperate former CEO trying to smear his rivals after being removed from power. Within hours, the narrative began to shift. News outlets that had initially reported on the hiring scandal started publishing doubtful op-eds, questioning the legitimacy of the leaked recordings. Prominent figures in the business world weighed in, some speculating that Richard might have exaggerated his claims in an attempt to reclaim his position. Whitmore had played his hand well. By framing Richard as a disgruntled executive with an agenda, he had put him on the defensive. The pressure wasn't just legal, it was strategic. Whitmore wanted Richard to burn through time and resources fighting lawsuits rather than exposing the rest of the corruption. Jennifer stormed into the office, slamming a file onto the desk. "He's manipulating the press. There's already a third-party investigation being set up, and you know damn well it's going to clear him of everything." Emma leaned back, rubbing her temples. "He's doing exactly what we expected. Distract, discredit, delay." Richard exhaled slowly. "Then we need something he can't spin." That night, Jennifer made a breakthrough. While going through old email archives, she stumbled upon a forgotten thread between Mark Sullivan and Whitmore, dated nearly a year earlier. At first glance, it was just another exchange about hiring approvals. But one message stood out. It referenced a bank account, one that wasn't tied to any official Westbridge records. Jennifer dug deeper, tracing the account number through multiple transactions. What she found changed everything. The account had received multiple large deposits from offshore firms, companies that, on paper, had no direct ties to Westbridge. But after cross-referencing financial records, a pattern emerged. These firms were clients and business partners of Westbridge, and the deposits correlated suspiciously with major contract approvals. Richard stared at the data. It was money laundering. Whitmore hadn't just been using Mark to manipulate hiring. He had been funneling illicit funds through shell companies, taking kickbacks from corporate deals disguised as recruitment payments. Jennifer looked up. This isn't just corruption. It's fraud on a massive scale. Emma's eyes widened. We're talking federal charges. Richard nodded slowly. Whitmore had always been careful, but this was something he couldn't explain away. This wasn't just about protecting his power anymore. This was about saving himself from prison. Richard sat in a dimly lit office, his eyes fixed on the screen as Jennifer worked beside him, fingers flying across the keyboard. The room was tense, filled with the quiet hum of the computer and the weight of what they were about to do. The evidence they had gathered against Whitmore was damning, but they needed more, something indisputable, something he couldn't talk his way out of. Jennifer glanced at him. Even if we release what we have now, he'll just spin it. He'll call it fabricated, say we're grasping at straws. Richard nodded. We need the original records. The ones he's been hiding. That was the problem. They knew Whitmore had kept meticulous records of his illicit transactions, somewhere. The offshore accounts, the hidden payments, the list of people he had placed inside Westbridge, they all existed. But those files weren't on any company server they had access to. Whitmore was too careful for that. They needed someone who could break through his security. Jennifer pulled out a phone and made a call. 2 hours later, they were sitting across from a man known only as Carter. He was a former cybersecurity expert who had worked with Westbridge's IT department years ago before leaving under mysterious circumstances. Richard didn't ask why, he just needed results. Carter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You're asking me to crack into a system I built security for. That's not easy. Jennifer didn't blink. We're not asking you to crack it. We just need to find where Whitmore keeps his most sensitive files. Carter sighed, running a hand through his short, graying hair. If he's as paranoid as you say, there's only one place it would be. A private server, probably air-gapped, meaning no internet access, no remote entry. Richard's jaw tightened. So how do we get in? Carter smirked. You don't, but he does. The plan came together quickly. Richard drafted an email posing as a key investor, demanding immediate access to financial documents related to an upcoming corporate deal. The language was aggressive, urgent, designed to trigger an immediate response. Carter set up a program that would mirror Whitmore's keystrokes the moment he logged into the server. The trick wasn't breaking in, it was getting Whitmore to do it himself. They sent the email. Then they waited. Whitmore took the bait within the hour. Sitting in his office, he logged into his private server, typing his credentials with the precision of a man who had done this countless times before. He scanned through his records, searching for discrepancies, unaware that every movement, every file accessed, was being duplicated in real time. Richard and Jennifer watched from their hidden workstation, the screen filling with data. Carter whistled. That's a lot of money moving around. The files contained everything they needed. A detailed record of offshore accounts, routing payments through fake companies, a list of bribes paid to key figures, both inside and outside Westbridge, and most shocking of all, plans to sell a controlling stake of Westbridge Capital to an undisclosed foreign entity. Bypassing legal scrutiny. If that deal went through, the company would no longer be under American ownership. Jennifer's breath caught. He was going to sell us out. Richard clenched his fists. Not anymore. The next morning, Richard called for an emergency board meeting. Whitmore was already waiting when Richard arrived. He sat at the head of the table, calm as ever, hands folded. Mark Sullivan's removal had shaken him, but he still believed he had the upper hand. The room was filled with tension as Richard placed a folder on the table. I have proof that Lawrence Whitmore has been using Westbridge Capital as his personal laundering service. Richard said, his voice steady. He's taken bribes, manipulated hiring, and funneled money into offshore accounts. And worst of all, he's been negotiating to sell this company behind our backs. A murmur spread through the board members. Some looked genuinely shocked. Others exchanged nervous glances, as if realizing they might be implicated. Whitmore exhaled slowly, shaking his head. This is nonsense. If you think some fabricated documents will. Richard interrupted. They're not fabricated. They came from your private server, which you logged into yesterday. A flicker of surprise crossed Whitmore's face. The first crack in his composure. Richard pushed a tablet across the table. These are transaction records tied to your offshore accounts. And these, he slid another document forward, are emails showing how you manipulated hiring at Westbridge to place people loyal to you in key positions. A heavy silence filled the room. One of the board members, an older man who had been a quiet supporter of Whitmore, cleared his throat. If these documents are real, this is serious. Whitmore let out a dry laugh. This doesn't prove anything. Do you really think you can take me down with a few files? You have no legal ground to stand on. Richard smiled. You're right, I don't. The doors to the boardroom opened. 2 FBI agents stepped inside. Jennifer had sent the evidence directly to federal investigators before the meeting. Whitmore hadn't just violated corporate ethics, he had committed financial crimes. One of the agents stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of financial fraud, bribery, and money laundering. Whitmore's face darkened. He turned to the board. But no one spoke in his defense. Even those who had once been loyal to him knew it was over. The agents moved in, securing his hands behind his back as they led him toward the exit. As he passed Richard, he lowered his voice. You think you've won? Richard met his gaze. I don't think. I know. Whitmore was escorted out of the building, leaving behind a stunned boardroom. Richard took a deep breath, then turned back to the table. Now, let's talk about rebuilding this company the right way. The moment Whitmore was escorted out of the boardroom in handcuffs, the weight of the situation truly settled in. Richard watched as the man who had spent years manipulating Westbridge Capital was led away. His expression unreadable. There was no anger, no fear, just quiet calculation. Whitmore wasn't a man who panicked. He was a man who planned. As the doors swung shut behind the FBI agents, the boardroom erupted into murmurs. Some directors exchanged nervous glances. Others whispered among themselves. No one wanted to be the first to speak. But the unease in the room was unmistakable. Then, Whitmore's voice echoed back to them, carried through the room like a parting shot. You think this ends with me? You have no idea what you've just started. Richard remained silent, watching the ripple of doubt spread through the board. Whitmore had planted a seed of fear, and it was already taking root. An emergency board meeting was called within the hour. Richard sat at the long mahogany table, hands folded in front of him. Across from him, a faction of the board, those who had long benefited from Whitmore's influence, were already shifting in their seats, distancing themselves from the scandal. They weren't here to save Whitmore, but they were determined to save themselves. We need to act carefully, one of the senior members said. If we don't control this situation, we could be facing catastrophic financial damage. Another board member leaned forward. The markets are already reacting. Westbridge stock has dropped 8% since the arrest. Investors are panicking. Richard remained composed. And how do you suggest we control the situation? The man hesitated, then cleared his throat. We contain the story. We frame Whitmore as a rogue operator. Ensure the public knows that the rest of the company had no knowledge of his actions. Jennifer, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. You want to bury this? The director frowned. We need to be realistic. If this escalates, it won't just be Whitmore facing consequences. The company could be sued. Investors could pull out, and we could face government intervention. That's not an outcome any of us want. Richard could feel the divide forming. There were those who saw Whitmore's removal as a chance to clean house. And then there were those who simply wanted to survive. Whitmore's counterattack came sooner than expected. Before the night was over, a series of leaked documents hit the financial press. The files had been sent from an anonymous source. But Richard knew exactly who had orchestrated it. Whitmore had played his final card before his arrest, ensuring that if he went down, he wouldn't go alone. The documents painted an ugly picture. Decades of backroom deals, questionable financial maneuvers, and regulatory violations were suddenly out in the open. Worse, the files implicated several board members who had conveniently ignored red flags over the years. Within minutes, the stock price plummeted further. Calls from investors flooded in, demanding answers. News stations ran breaking coverage, speculating whether Westbridge Capital could survive the scandal. Jennifer stormed into Richard's office, phone in hand. This is bad. He didn't need to ask. He could see it on the news ticker running along the bottom of the screen. Westbridge Capital in crisis. New leaks reveal years of corporate misconduct. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. We expected him to retaliate. Not like this, Jennifer countered. This isn't just about him. He's burning the entire company down on his way out. The next morning, the boardroom was in full meltdown. Half the directors looked ready to resign. The others were frantically trying to distance themselves from the mess. Some wanted Richard to step in and reassure investors. Others wanted him out entirely, fearing he was too tied to the controversy. One director stood abruptly. We need to consider an external crisis management team. Someone to handle this without emotions. Richard met his gaze. This isn't about emotions. It's about cleaning up the rot before it destroys us. A long silence followed. Then, another voice. Or maybe it's already too late. The words hung in the air. For the first time since this began, Richard wondered if Whitmore had already won. The conference room was packed. Every seat at the long glass table was filled, and additional chairs had been brought in along the walls to accommodate those who wanted a say in what was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came when people knew they were moments away from either salvation or disaster. Richard stood at the head of the table, looking at the faces staring back at him. Some were tense, others indifferent, a few clearly hostile. The events of the past week had shattered Westbridge Capital's carefully maintained facade. And now they had reached the breaking point. He took a slow breath before speaking. We have two choices. His voice carried through the room, cutting through the hushed murmurs. We can pretend this never happened. We can suppress the damage, close ranks, and hope the market forgets. But let's be honest, burying this won't make it go away. The world has seen what's inside this company. You can't unsee corruption. A few members shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, waiting. The alternative is we confront this head on. We acknowledge what happened, hold the right people accountable, and rebuild this company with integrity. It won't be easy. It won't be painless. But it's the only way Westbridge survives in the long run. Silence. Then, the expected resistance. A senior board member, a man who had made his fortune in private equity, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Richard, if we go down that path, we'll be inviting lawsuits, investigations, government oversight. We could be looking at years of litigation. Do you really think investors will stick around if we admit to massive corporate fraud? Another voice chimed in. We're in free fall already. Our stock is plummeting. We don't have the luxury of playing morality police. Richard had been expecting this. He folded his hands on the table. Do you think investors will stick around if they believe we're still corrupt? That this company is still run by people who looked the other way while Whitmore stole from us? A murmur spread through the room. Another board member leaned forward. Let's be pragmatic. If we control the narrative, we might be able to avoid the worst of it. Announce a few resignations. Cooperate with regulators just enough to satisfy them, and move forward without exposing the entire operation. Richard's jaw tightened. And in 5 years? When another scandal breaks because we refused to fix the root problem. When we've replaced one set of corrupt executives with another. Because make no mistake, if we don't purge this system now, it will fester again. He let the words settle. Then he delivered the final blow. Westbridge Capital can either survive as a company that learns from its failures or crumble under the weight of its own deceit. The choice is yours. The room broke into a frenzy of debate. Some board members doubled down on damage control, arguing that a full-scale purge would weaken the company too much. Others, likely fearing their own exposure, began advocating for Richard's plan, not out of principle, but out of self-preservation. Jennifer sat to Richard's right, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Emma was by the door, checking her phone, likely monitoring media coverage and investor reactions in real time. Richard held his ground, letting them argue. This was a battle of attrition, and he knew the longer they debated, the more cracks would form. Then, just as the tension reached a breaking point, the door opened. Michael Donovan entered with the kind of quiet authority that made the room fall silent almost instantly. As one of the largest shareholders in Westbridge, his presence alone carried weight. He was a seasoned investor, known for his ability to turn failing companies around, not by squeezing profits, but by restoring credibility. He took a seat at the table without asking permission. "I've been listening." His voice was calm, measured, "and I think Richard is right." A murmur spread, some surprised, some uneasy. "I've seen companies survive scandals before. Some tried to cover up the damage, silence the whistleblowers, and ride out the storm. They didn't last. The ones that did, the ones that emerged stronger, were the ones that cleaned house." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've put together a transition plan. It includes a full leadership overhaul for anyone tied to Whitmore's dealings, an independent compliance board to monitor future business practices, and most importantly, voluntary cooperation with the SEC and the DOJ to mitigate potential legal action." Richard watched as the balance of power in the room shifted. For the first time since this battle began, he wasn't the only one fighting. The vote was called. One by one, hands went up. Some did it reluctantly, some did it decisively, but by the time it was over, Richard had won. The restructuring plan was approved. Whitmore's allies were ousted. Westbridge Capital wasn't out of danger yet, but it had taken its first real step toward survival. Jennifer let out a slow breath. Emma offered a small, knowing smile. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally creeping in. He had spent months fighting for this moment, but he knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The boardroom was quieter than usual. The rush of voices that had once filled these meetings was now replaced by an air of unease, the kind that only came when people were waiting for something inevitable to happen. Richard sat at the head of the table, fingers interlocked, eyes scanning the faces around him. The vote to approve Westbridge Capital's restructuring had passed, but the war was far from over. Even after Whitmore's arrest and the board's decision to reform, Richard knew better than to assume victory. Corruption, especially at this level, didn't disappear overnight. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And that moment, it seemed, had arrived. Jennifer entered the room, moving with urgency. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, her voice low but sharp. "We have a problem." Richard didn't react immediately. He simply nodded and stood, motioning for her to follow him into his office. Once inside, Jennifer locked the door behind her and handed him a tablet. "I found something." Richard took the device and scrolled through the emails she had pulled from Westbridge's internal servers. His expression darkened with every word he read. Someone had been in contact with Whitmore, despite his arrest, and not just anyone, Robert Langston, a major shareholder and one of Whitmore's most trusted allies. Langston had been quiet throughout the company's restructuring efforts, never openly opposing the changes but never supporting them either. Now, Richard knew why. He had been working behind the scenes, using his influence to stall the reform process while coordinating with Whitmore's outside contacts. The emails were clear. Langston was trying to overturn the board's decision and reinstate Whitmore's network of loyalists. Jennifer crossed her arms. "He's not just trying to protect himself. He's trying to reverse everything we've done." Richard set the tablet down, his jaw tightening. "Then we stop him." The confrontation happened later that evening. Langston's office was tucked away in one of the upper floors, far from the commotion of the main executive spaces. Richard didn't bother knocking. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Langston looked up from his desk, clearly unsurprised to see him. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Richard closed the door behind him. "You've been working with Whitmore." Langston didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He simply adjusted his cufflinks and shrugged. "I've been working to protect my investment." Richard placed the tablet on the desk and tapped the screen. "These emails say otherwise." Langston barely glanced at them. "And what exactly do you think that proves?" Richard studied him, recognizing the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. "It proves that you've been actively sabotaging the reform process. That you've been in contact with an indicted criminal. That you've been trying to manipulate this company back into the hands of the very people who nearly destroyed it." Langston smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And if I have, what are you going to do about it?" Richard wasn't rattled. He had spent too much time dealing with men like Langston to be intimidated by arrogance. Langston continued, his voice smooth. You think you've won because Whitmore's in jail? Because you convinced a few scared board members to back your plan? Let me tell you something. Richard, this company doesn't run on ethics. It runs on money. And if I decide to pull my investment, so will others. Investors trust me. They don't trust you. Not yet. Richard kept his expression neutral. But inside, he was measuring every word, every calculated move. Langston leaned forward. Now, you have two choices. You can make this easy on yourself. Step down. Let the company move on from this ridiculous crusade. And maybe I'll ensure you walk away with something. Or, his smirk widened, you keep pushing, and I'll bury you in lawsuits, stockholder revolts, and government scrutiny until Westbridge collapses under its own weight. The room was silent. Then Richard chuckled, just a small, quiet laugh. Langston's smirk faded. Something funny? Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it face up on the desk. The screen was still recording. Langston's expression hardened. I'm not the only one who heard that, Richard said calmly, and I'm not the only one watching you. For the first time, Langston hesitated. Richard leaned forward, voice steady. You think you hold all the cards? I've been 3 steps ahead of you since the moment I walked in here. Langston narrowed his eyes, but Richard could see the shift, doubt creeping in. Then Richard delivered the final blow. I sent your financial records to the FBI yesterday. Langston's composure finally cracked. Richard continued, his voice low. We traced the payments, offshore transfers, foreign investors tied to fraudulent hedge funds. You weren't just helping Whitmore, you were funneling money through Westbridge just like he was. Langston's fingers curled into a fist. You have no idea who you're messing with. Richard met his glare without blinking. Neither do you. Silence stretched between them. Then Langston exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging just slightly. He wasn't an idiot. He knew what this meant. Richard stood, pocketing his phone. Your only way out is resignation. Effective immediately. If you fight this, you won't just lose your shares, you'll lose your freedom. Langston stared at him, the weight of his downfall sinking in. He had played the game well, but he had underestimated just how far Richard was willing to go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Langston nodded. I'll draft my resignation by morning. Richard didn't smile, didn't gloat, he simply nodded. Good choice. As he walked out of the office, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time since this all began, the battle was truly over. The atmosphere inside Westbridge Capital had shifted. The weight of corruption that had once suffocated the company was beginning to lift. But Richard knew that purging the rot was only the first step. The real challenge was ensuring that it never returned. With Langston gone and Whitmore behind bars, the remaining board members were either scrambling to salvage their reputations or cautiously aligning themselves with Richard. He wasted no time. Within days, he had assembled a new internal oversight committee, composed of individuals with no past affiliations with Whitmore's network. Transparency, accountability. These were no longer corporate buzzwords, they were non-negotiable principles. One of his first orders of business was to audit every hiring decision made in the past 2 years. Dozens of employees who had been hired through backdoor deals were quietly shown the exit. At the same time, Richard made it clear that those who had been unfairly rejected due to Whitmore's corrupt system would be given another chance. Jennifer, who had been at his side since the beginning, reviewed the list of names. Some of these candidates were at the top of their fields. She said, shaking her head, we lost good people because of Whitmore's greed. Richard exhaled, looking at the massive list on his desk. Then it's time we fix that. Months later, the courtroom was packed. Mark Sullivan sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine suit wrinkled, his face tight with the weight of his downfall. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before delivering the verdict, guilty on all counts. Richard watched from the back of the room as the judge read the sentence. 10 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime ban from any corporate leadership position. It was a crushing blow for a man who had built his career on deceit. Jennifer leaned toward Richard. Think he'll appeal? Richard didn't look away from the courtroom floor. He can try, won't change the outcome. And then there was Whitmore. Unlike Mark, he wasn't just facing corporate fraud charges, his financial dealings had triggered a major federal investigation. The Securities and Exchange Commission had uncovered additional evidence of money laundering, offshore accounts, and fraudulent business practices dating back over a decade. By the time they were done with him, Whitmore wasn't looking at years behind bars. He was looking at decades. As they led him out of the courtroom, his eyes briefly met Richard's. There was no anger, no outburst, just the silent acknowledgement that he had lost. And Richard had won. The board of directors had made their decision weeks ago. But today was the formal announcement. Richard sat at the long, polished table as the chairman cleared his throat. We recognize the role you've played in stabilizing Westbridge Capital during this crisis. He began, which is why the board unanimously voted to extend your contract as CEO. The words should have felt satisfying. But they didn't. Richard looked around the room. He had spent his entire career climbing to the top of the corporate ladder. But after everything he had seen, everything he had fought against, he wasn't sure this was where he belonged anymore. He clasped his hands together, considering his words carefully. I appreciate the board's confidence, he said finally, but if Westbridge is truly going to move forward, it needs new leadership, someone who hasn't spent years inside the same system that allowed corruption to thrive. A murmur spread through the room. Some board members looked relieved, others confused. Jennifer turned to him, eyes searching. You're stepping down? Richard exhaled slowly. I think it's time. Later that evening, Richard stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. New York was still alive, still moving. The world hadn't stopped just because one company had rooted out its corruption. There were more Whitmores out there, more Langstons, more people manipulating the system for their own gain. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number flashing on the screen. He hesitated, then answered. A smooth, measured voice came through the line. I know what you did at Westbridge. But there are more out there. Bigger, smarter, more dangerous. Richard didn't reply immediately. He glanced down at the whiskey glass in his hand, the amber liquid reflecting the city lights. The voice on the other end continued. Are you ready for the next fight? Richard let the silence stretch for a moment before a slow smile crossed his face. I'm listening. The rain drummed against the windowpane of the small bar, blurring the neon lights outside. Richard sat in a dimly lit corner, nursing a whiskey that had long since lost its warmth. Across from him, David Holloway leaned forward, his face half shadowed under the hanging light fixture. He was older than Richard had expected, his gray-streaked hair and deep-set eyes hinting at a man who had seen too much, fought too many battles, and lost more than he cared to admit. David slid a worn leather folder across the table. Richard hesitated before picking it up, flipping it open to reveal pages of financial records, offshore account details, and a complex web of connections between private equity firms, high-ranking government officials, and multinational corporations. Richard exhaled slowly. And this is supposed to prove what? Exactly? David's voice was steady but edged with quiet urgency. That Whitmore was just a pawn. The real players? They don't sit in corporate boardrooms. They own the boardrooms. They fund elections. They write the laws that keep them untouchable. Richard flipped through more pages, his fingers tightening over a document showing a direct link between a senator and a hedge fund involved in questionable dealings. And what do you want from me? David's gaze didn't waver. Help me bring them down. Richard let the silence stretch between them. He wasn't naive. Taking down Whitmore had already cost him nearly everything. This was bigger, riskier, deadlier. You're asking me to walk into a war, Richard finally said. David nodded. Yes, but you've already been fighting it, whether you realize it or not. The next morning, Richard sat in his office at Westbridge Capital, staring at the Manhattan skyline. The city moved on, indifferent to the battles being waged behind closed doors. Jennifer knocked once before stepping inside, her expression unreadable. She had seen the folder, read the documents, understood exactly what this meant. You can't win this, she said softly. Richard turned to her, waiting. You barely survived Whitmore, and he was nothing compared to this. She placed a second folder in front of him, this one thinner, but just as damning. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of his wife and daughter, taken from a distance. Alongside it was a small, plain white card with a single handwritten message. Stop while you still can. The air in the room grew heavy. Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper. If you keep going, they won't just try to ruin your career. They'll come for you and your family. Richard stared at the photograph. He had known this moment would come. He had prepared for it. But knowing and feeling were two different things. He could walk away now, take his victory, rebuild Westbridge, and never look back. It would be easy. But when had anything ever been easy? He took a slow breath, setting the photograph aside. Then he reached for his phone. I need to make a call. The boardroom was silent, the kind of silence that stretched deep, thick with unspoken words and restrained emotions. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table. His fingers steepled as he scanned the faces of the board members, some shocked, some relieved, others struggling to process what they had just heard. I've done what I set out to do, he said, his voice steady. Westbridge Capital is no longer under the control of corrupt forces. The system has been cleaned. The right people are in place to ensure it stays that way. But my fight doesn't end here. It just takes a different form. A few members exchanged wary glances. One of them, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, cleared his throat. Richard, you've stabilized the company, restored trust, and sent a message that corruption won't be tolerated. Why walk away now? Because there's a bigger war out there, Richard thought. Because what happened here was just a symptom of something much worse. He leaned forward slightly. Because I refuse to sit in a comfortable chair and pretend that what happened here isn't happening elsewhere, on a much larger scale. Jennifer, standing near the door, said nothing, but he could feel her watching him. The weight of years of working together reflected in her gaze. She had known this was coming. Maybe she had even expected it before he had. No one objected outright. They couldn't. The decision was made. Richard Cole, the man who had built Westbridge Capital from the ground up, was leaving. The rain had cleared by the time he stepped out of the building. The city smelled of damp pavement and the crisp bite of autumn. He stood for a moment, looking up at the gleaming skyscraper that had been his battlefield for years. A black car pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, revealing David Holloway in the driver's seat. I take it the board didn't throw you a farewell party? Richard smirked. Not exactly. He climbed into the passenger seat, shutting the door behind him. The sound felt final. David handed him a manila folder. We've been watching a particular hedge fund that's moving money through shell corporations across 3 continents. Connections to a few senators, some offshore accounts, and at least 2 major banks. Richard flipped open the folder, scanning the names, the transactions. It was worse than he had imagined. And yet, not surprising. David studied him for a moment. This isn't like Westbridge. The people we're going after now don't just fire you from a company. They make sure you disappear. Richard closed the folder, resting it on his lap. Good, he said. That means we're finally going after the right people. David smiled, shaking his head as he pulled the car into traffic. The phone in Richard's pocket vibrated. A message. We have our first target. Are you ready? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out at the city, the towering skyline, the flashing billboards, the millions of people moving through their lives, unaware of the forces manipulating their world behind closed doors. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and let out a breath. I'm ready. At the heart of this story is a simple truth. Power isn't just about holding a position, it's about what you do with it. Richard Cole had every reason to walk away after exposing corruption within his own company. But he chose to fight for something bigger. His journey reminds us that real change starts when people refuse to look the other way. But this was just one battle. How many more hidden agendas are shaping the world around us? And if given the chance, would you dare to uncover the truth? If you want more eye-opening stories like this, subscribe to Undercover Truths and join us as we dive into the secrets they don't want you to know.